So last week we talked about prayer, and on the handy-dandy syllabus, which everybody should have gotten. Are you on? You're not on the email list yet. We need to take care of that. So, who's managing that?
Andre.
Andre?
He will pass it to me.
Yeah. So, give us your email. Does anybody have any questions from last time? No questions? You want another cookie?
Take them away from me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think, we need to start out talking about the church's official discipline of fasting. And one of the things that's important with all of these disciplines, just like we talked about prayer, there's growth and there's change in the application of the discipline as you mature, in one hand, certainly physically, but also as you mature spiritually. Once you've gotten to know the morning and evening prayers and you can recite them by heart and you don't think about them, it's time to move to something else. That's not to say you still don't do the morning and evening prayers, but that other things are necessary for you to deepen your spiritual life. Because the whole point is not simply to get through a text, but the real point is to connect with God. And if you're just sitting there reciting words from a book, that doesn't necessarily mean you're connecting with God. God does not need those prayers. There's a wonderful story about Metropolitan Anthony Bloom when he was a kid. He was a super zealot, and he was fasting, he was going to church and saying his prayers and doing everything. And he went to his spiritual father and he said, "Oh, I'm afraid I missed my prayers one night, and I was worried about it. I've been worried about it all week, and I didn't know if I should repeat them in the morning, the evening prayers in the morning, along with the morning, and on and on and on and on." And he said, and the spiritual father looked at him and said, "So, you think the ceiling is going to fall in if you don't say your prayers, huh?" And he said, "Yeah, I do." And so his spiritual father said, "Okay, I forbid you to pray. I forbid you to pray. The only thing that you can pray, and you say it 3 times and go to bed, is, 'Lord, save me for the sake of those who love me. Lord, save me for the sake of the prayers of those who love me.'" And he was quite taken aback by this, but he did it. And he came back eventually and said, well, his spiritual father asked him how things were going. And he said, well, it's just been transformative. He's not just saying words, to the air, trying to get through a text, but he's really connecting with God. He's remembering all of those who love him and giving thanks for them and praying for them and knowing that they're praying for him. And so it was a much more profoundly authentic experience of prayer. Now, fasting rules are also not absolute. It's not a matter of going to hell if you eat something with whey in it on a Friday during Lent. You've checked the label and 30 ingredients on the package, there's whey. You think, oh no, I'm lost. The demons are going to come and drag my soul into hell because of... No. You think the ceiling is going to fall in on you because you ate a little whey and a cookie during Lent? That doesn't mean we don't need to take the rules strictly, but you have to be intelligent in your application of the rules. Now, there are also different stages of life. Usually after 70, people are pretty much dispensed from any kind of strict fasting. Now, there's plenty of people who've lived their whole lives structuring their diet according to the fasting rules of the church, and it's just natural for them, and they just don't think about it. But if you're over 70, it's pretty hard if you haven't been doing it earlier, for most of your life, to go vegan for 6 weeks for one of the Lenten periods. So that's one area. Another area where fasting rules are not applied is for women who are pregnant or nursing. It's absolutely forbidden for pregnant or nursing women to fast, according to the rules. You eat whatever you need, and that's your fasting. There's another general rule in the spiritual life, which I think is very important, is that you find, according to your own practice of the disciplines of the church, what really works for you. What is it that really brings you to greater clarity of mind, to greater mindfulness, to greater acuity of vision and experience of God? What kind of prayer does that? What kind of fasting does that? How do you apply all of these? Because all of these are canons, not in the sense that they're laws of the church, but rather they're rules, like a ruler, by which you can measure, literally, your practice. So, are you at 99%? Are you at 11.5 inches out of a 12-inch ruler, or the 98th centimeter on a meter stick, or the 198th, or whatever? You gotta figure out. They're there to help you as a guide, and always a little, and often, and almost always, a challenge that is probably beyond your reach. So it's a constant challenge, so that you're constantly striving to do just a little bit better, that you can never think that, oh, I've achieved it. I love this story told by one of the leaders of the Antiochian Evangelical Orthodox. It was a movement of 3,000 evangelicals who came into Orthodoxy in the late 80s, and the leaders had been Campus Crusade leaders, and so this one Father John, he said, when I was an evangelical, I knew that I was on the 99th percentile of spirituality. I had my quiet time. I read my scriptures. I did my Bible study. I was up there. I was really successful in my spiritual life. And then I became Orthodox, he said. And I knew that I was basically at the first percentile. and could only marvel about those who are up there. And one of the whole points is that we should never think that, we should never pat ourselves on the back. We should never, in other words, should never become proud and vainglorious over having fulfilled the rule, because then it's a complete waste. Just like, for example, as St. John Chrysostom said, if you fast very strictly during Lent, and then you devour your brother with criticism and and gossip and slander, it's all for naught. And your fasting is just simple hypocrisy, pure hypocrisy. You might as well go have a steak. Now, we fast, and ultimately we do consume our brothers and sisters with gossip. But I'm not suggesting we all need to go out for a steak on Holy Friday. But what we need to do is we need to be very realistic in our spiritual life. What are we doing, and why are we doing it, other than to draw closer to God, and to cleanse ourselves, and to purify ourselves of the sinful passions, and bringing ourselves under control, which is really what fasting is about. Because fasting is not only about what you eat, it's also about what you do, what you look at, what you listen to, and what you say, and what you think. It's all about self-denial, ascesis. Now, if it leads you to pride and vainglory, because you're just so good, then you have a real problem. And that's the main thing that it doesn't, and that's the main thing you need to go to take to confession. Actually, the story of St. Mary of Egypt, everybody knows the story, right? Is really about, part of it is about the pride and vainglory of Zosima, the priest who went and discovered her. Because he knew he was Mr. Ascetic, or Father Ascetic. He excelled everybody in his ascetic discipline. He could fast better than they could, he could pray better than they could, he could stand through these endless services, he could do a million prostrations, and on and on and on and on and on. And the text says, and he excelled in every ascetic exercise, so that he shone above all the other monks in the world. Well, that's very ironic way of expressing that he was consumed by his own vainglory and by his own pride. And he essentially goes out into the wilderness and says, Lord, show me a greater ascetic than me. Now, there's another story about that from the Desert Fathers, and that's St. Anthony, who, of course, is one of the greatest of the ascetic fathers, who lived in a cave in the desert. For a while, he lived in the tombs, you can imagine, in the pagan tombs, which were the haunts of demons, where the demons would come and literally beat him to pulp. And there was one time he got beaten up so bad by the demons that they thought he was dead, and so they took him and laid him out in church, you know, like a corpse ready for a funeral service. And then he revived, and he said, "Take me back."
Why did he want to be there?
What?
Why was he there?
To test himself, to be tried. It's ascetic. It's kind of asceticism that is very limited to monasticism. But anyway, St. Anthony was a great ascetic, and he excelled in self-denial and so an angel comes to him and says, "I'm going to show you somebody who's more holy than you are." And he says, "Okay." And so the angel takes him through the air to the city of Alexandria and shows him a cobbler, a guy sitting in his shop, half underground shop, making boots. And the angel says to him, "This man is more holy than you are." He sits there, he prays for everybody who comes by, and he has the Trisagion continuously going in his heart. And he's holier than you are. So, one of the things that's absolutely crucial in the spiritual life is never, ever, ever to become to allow yourself to become vainglorious over your fasting, over your prayer rule, over your discipline. Because somebody's going to be better than you are, and that's all right. And all that matters is what you. It's in other words, it's entirely between you and God, and you let your spiritual father know what you're doing, and let him decide what you need to do and what you don't need to do. So, when it comes to fasting, the rules of the church were devised in the early Byzantine era and reflect. Some of them, they reflect Greek culture in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 4th century. So, for example, certain things are understood according to that culture as opposed to our culture. So, for us, lobster is incredibly a luxurious food, right? But for that culture of that time, lobster, shrimp, oysters, much less clams and mussels and squid and octopus, were all classed as plants, according to. And so you can eat any of that on any day of the year except Good Friday, when you're not supposed to have anything. Actually, lobster in America has not always been a great luxury food. There were actually riots in the prisons in Maine in the 19th century because all they would feed the prisoners was lobster. And they were having too many lobsters, and it was just...
Enough.
Enough already.
They used to wash up on the shores. They would be collected and put into the gardens and buried whole because they were in such abundance.
Yeah, fertilizer. Yeah. So, so there are some things that seem rather odd in our culture. Another thing that's a little odd is olive oil. Now, you go to the grocery store and there are dozens of different. There's canola oil, there's peanut oil, there's safflower oil, there's walnut oil, there's avocado oil, there's 8 different kinds of olive oil, all this other stuff. Well, in Greek culture, in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, actually the whole Mediterranean, they used olive oil almost exclusively. And if you have been, especially in a monastery in Greece, or in a Greek monastery, even if it's here, on a non-fast day, the food is basically floating in olive oil. It's nothing like Americans would ever do. Even, because we're so health conscious about fat. But I mean, there can be, half a cup of olive oil poured over your vegetables. And that was just like a normal thing. And then you get a whole ration of olive oil you dip your bread in and whatever. So there's this whole regulation of olive oil in the fasting rules. But the specific fasting rules, for the most part, are and if you take the spirit as well as the letter, it becomes something quite doable, even if it's rather strict. Just to kind of cut it all short, when there's a fast day or a fasting period, you basically go vegan. To put it into contemporary terms, and the rule of fasting is no meat or animal products, including poultry. There's no distinction between meat, red meat, and poultry. No dairy, no milk, no cheese, no ice cream, nothing, no milk products, no eggs, no fish. Actually, this is another culturally specific thing. In Russia, what else was there? There were no vegetables half the year. So what do you eat? Fish. Then olive oil and wine. Now again, in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 4th century, people drank wine. They didn't, there wasn't, yeah, there was beer too, but then there was, I don't think there was much in the way of distilled spirits, you know, like vodka or gin or something like that. So the fasting regulation is no wine. Now, very often in our culture that gets translated to no alcohol. Now, if you can be a real Pharisee about it, and you can and if it's a wine and oil day, because there are degrees of abstinence within a fasting period. A day of fasting actually means to fast. It means that you, and traditionally it means you don't eat anything until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Usually you can drink water, which kind of gets extended to coffee and tea and without milk. But fasting means fasting, not eating. Then there's abstinence. And abstinence refers to what are the things that you abstain from. And these are regulated, especially fish, wine, and oil. So there are certain days in the calendar, even during Great Lent. So for example, on the Feast of the Annunciation, you can eat fish. It's there are 2 days in Great Lent and Holy Week when you can eat fish. 3. Annunciation, Palm Sunday, and Annunciation and Palm Sunday. Even Holy Thursday is a no fish day, technically. Now, that does not include clams, oysters, mussels, squid, shrimp, crab, uni, probably. I don't think they regulated uni. But basically, other days, so for example, on Saturdays and Sundays during Lent, for the most part, are wine and oil days. Then on Lazarus Saturday, they don't permit fish, but they permit caviar. Now, that's a big thing in Greek culture, and also in Russian culture. But for Americans, caviar. You know, we don't do that. And so what happens is that the rules have to be adapted for each cultural context. We also have to remember that when these rules were formulated, it's not like people could go to Safeway or to Costco and stock up. Rather, you ate what was seasonal, what was coming out of the fields at the time, what could be hunted or fished or pulled out of the sea, especially in the Mediterranean, what could be pulled out of the sea. And you didn't have much variety. Here, you can have strawberries in January, and you can have winter squash in February, and you can have peaches in December, and it doesn't, you know, there's nothing seasonal anymore because our whole distribution system is you can get anything at any time, practically anywhere. There's also a very strange thing in our culture, which makes it radically different from the Mediterranean at the 1,500 years ago. Now, broccoli is more expensive than chicken. Broccoli is more expensive than beef or pork sometimes. That was something utterly unthinkable. The common people back 1,500 years ago it was a huge treat for them to have some kind of meat. The poor subsisted on bread, and it wasn't Wonder Bread, you know. It was the very heavy whole grain, substantial bread that was full of nutrients. Now, if all you ate was white bread, then I don't know, you'd probably die within.
Scurvy.
Yeah, you get scurvy and die. So everything had to be adapted. In Alaska, one of the first adaptations the missionaries made, because the only thing that people ate up there most of the year was salmon. There were no vegetables. They tried to grow vegetables, and that was mixed. You know, once they got inland, they could find places to grow vegetables, and so now they grow cabbages that are that big around, and carrots the size of, I don't know.
But they only grow tubers and things like
Right.
that. They really don't grow. You can't grow wheat.
No. So adaptations have been made in the fasting rules. It's a very useful thing to try, say during a Great Lent, to observe it strictly. Even just take a week and try and observe it strictly. If you can do the whole thing, it's an interesting experience. Especially in Great Lent, since you're not supposed to eat from dinner on Sunday until after the pre-sanctified on Wednesday. It's a strict fast. I have another story about that. There was I was on Valom, and one of my obediences was to accompany the abbot and work especially with foreign visitors and especially donors, and but I got pulled onto a kind of a special trip because all of the senior personnel from the major monasteries in Russia, the econom of Optin or Pustin, the vice abbot of Trinity St. Sergius Lavra, all of these people. There was about a dozen of these people from all these major monasteries in Russia. And then there was Pope Nikolai. And Pope Nikolai was a Ukrainian Prichodsky Pope, parish priest. And he was a rather large, jolly fellow. And he was not too observant of some of the rules. Valom had a rule for being absolutely dry, for example, and so he brought a couple of several liters of Everclear, spirit, which is spirit. It's called, which is 99%
Grain alcohol.
grain alcohol, which he would add to whatever he wanted. If not, if he didn't add it to anything, he would just drink it straight. Well, Pope Nikolai was, if you can imagine, quite a character. And he made me look small. And evidently, so this was August, and so he was doing well. The story is that we got stuck on this island, and it's a long story. But Pope Nikolai would eat himself up to about 400 pounds from Pascha through Christmas. And then Great Lent would start, and he would eat nothing until Pascha, where he lost over 100 pounds during Great Lent of not eating for 6 or 7 weeks. And then he'd start it all over again, and I'm sure accompanied on appropriate times with abundant quantities of spirit. interesting, lots of characters, Um, there are many different kinds of little rules and practices that go along. So, for example, this 3-day fast at the beginning of Great Lent, and of total fast. At Valon, they actually they can't require it because some people need to eat. So at the end of the day, they make chicken soup. Chicken soup means a potato cooked and it's with the water that it was cooked in. For those who are too chicken to to do the fast.
Double entendre.
Yeah, and I was kind of pleased to know that in Russian it's the same expression of chicken soup as it is in English. Then also there are one of the fasting days outside of the Lenten periods is the beheading of St. John the Baptist. Well, in some Slavic cultures, and I'm not sure which ones, I think it's the Carpatho-Russian thing, that you can't serve anything on a platter.
We practice that in Kodiak. No platters, no plates.
Or anything that's round.
Yeah, it's just...
So serving a head of cabbage on a platter is not going to work on St. John the Baptist because his head was served on a platter. So there's all sorts of little folk customs and things like that go along with it. But just the basic rule for Great Lent, and usually within Great Lent, the first week is very strict. And then there's other parts that are observed in some places more strictly than others. And then Holy Week is a very strict fast week, except for Palm Sunday and Holy Thursday, and Friday is supposed to be an absolute fast, and even Holy Saturday is supposed to be a strict fast until the liturgy, which is not supposed to be at 10 o'clock in the morning, it's supposed to be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's 4 hours long, and so you're allowed some dried fruit, grapes, and a glass of wine. No oil, but wine. Waiting for the midnight liturgy, which isn't at 12, it's at 3 or 4, according to the Typicon. So everything is spaced. But if we can just keep the basic parameters of the fast, it can be a very, very edifying experience. One of the things that happens, especially if you fast fairly seriously, like the first few days of the Great Fast, is that you're miserable for a couple days, and then your mind, you have this extraordinary clarity, which is really, really spiritually transformative. And you can see why people embrace this kind of rule of fasting. Because the whole point of the fasting, once again, is to bring you into a deeper experience of communion with God. It's not an end in itself. If you fast so that you can say that you fasted, then you fasted in vain. But if it brings you to a deeper and deeper and more into deeper purity and limpidity of awareness, that's the whole point. And if you do this in the context of the liturgical life of the church, being able, going to the services, and especially in a monastery. I mean, this is where this all was developed. Great Lent is not just, it's not just orthoaerobics. in church, with all the prostrations and up and down and up and down, and there's a lot of prostrations, obviously. It becomes this profound spiritual ascent, which is the whole point. So that by the time Pascha comes around, you really can say, I have beheld the resurrection of Christ, and see the transformation of your own soul. Of course, the whole point of repentance, and Lent is about repentance, is not to feel guilty about your sins, but to be transformed in the renewal of your mind. And and fasting is one of the most important tools that there is. Now, obviously, I am no great faster. And it's quite hypocritical for me to be talking about fasting. However, I'm speaking from the books. And the monastic experience is something that I've tasted, shall we say. So I want to encourage you in the fasting. And especially during the Lenten periods. It's a period of purification. Now, one of the benefits of fasting, of keeping this kind of rule of not eating until 3 o'clock. You're hungry. In other words, you're hungry most of the time. You're not eating to satiety. It's hard to eat to satiety with just vegetables, right? With no oil, no butter, no nothing on it. Unless you do the usual Slavic thing and OD on carbs, potatoes and pasta and bread, and that's not helpful either, because it makes you feel even hungrier. But if you do this and you experience, you actually can experience a real profound opening within yourself. You also begin to see yourself more clearly. You not only see God more clearly, you see yourself more clearly. Because what usually happens when we get hungry? We get testy, right? So we see our own irritability. We see our own passions, and everything comes up. We get frustrated, we get angry, our resentment comes up, all of this stuff comes up. Well, and here this is a spiritual exercise, right? Well, it's actually very important and very valuable, because you take that to confession and you get rid of it. And you learn how to master it. And you can see it arising within yourself, and you learn how to cut off the thoughts. One of the most important aspects of fasting is learning how to cut off thoughts. Because ultimately, the fasting rules of the Church are designed to bring one to a greater spiritual awareness. But they are also there to make us more conscious so that we can watch our thoughts and see the thoughts as they arise. In other words, I'll use a classic example that I like to use. It's Friday afternoon at the monastery in Manton. Pre-sanctified is over. There was some god-awful starch thing for lunch, and it's a long time till breakfast tomorrow, and it's getting dark, and there's that horrible great Compline service in the evening that just is forever and ever, and you're sitting there irritated, and you sneak a listen to the radio in your cell. And on that radio is the ad for McDonald's.
Don't listen to the radio.
Don't listen to the radio. And so it's talking about how good a Big Mac is. And so you've got this idea implanted in your mind. You weren't even thinking about it until this external provocation hit your mind. And you start thinking about that Big Mac. And you're turning it around in your mind and think, oh, that sounds really good. Then you can practically taste it. And you begin salivating. And before you know it, what are you doing? You're swiping the car keys, and you're heading the 45 miles down the road to the nearest McDonald's at breakneck speed, salivating all the way, thinking about that Big Mac. And maybe, just maybe, you'll think, what am I doing? It's Friday during Lent. I don't care. Not supposed to have a hamburger. Well, McDonald's, is there any meat in that hamburger anyway? There's another story that novices or the seminarians at Jordanville used to go to McDonald's and get milkshakes, of course, but there was no dairy in the milkshake, so they were actually kosher. And would sit on the stairs of the church on Fridays during Lent and torment the monks, as they ate their milkshake. Of course, I think it's about 30 miles to a McDonald's from Jordanville. So what this does is it's an example of how a temptation can actually hit you. And I use this, this temptation of food, in the context of fasting, because it's a Friday during Lent. There's kind of a double fast. There's the Friday, and then there's the Lent, and there's all of this, and so. But when we get seized by an external provocation, in other words, you get exposed to what they say on the radio. It wasn't necessarily in your mind even before that, but since you loved McDonald's hamburgers, you had a predisposition to accept the provocation. And so what happens? The provocation comes, you like the idea, you start turning it over in your mind. Then you decide, okay, I'm going to think about this. This sounds really nice. And so you start thinking about it. And you start turning it over in your mind. And then other aspects of your being come into it. And so you can taste it, you can smell it, it's all in your mind. But by that time, you're in captivity. The thought has you in captivity, and then finally, at some point, and you've even started reacting physically to it. You're salivating. You can taste that hamburger. And by that time, what's happened is you've either made a conscious, or if this is habitual, an unconscious decision to act on that thought. And that's when you grab the keys and go rocketing down the mountain at 70 miles an hour through the cows and the and the deer to go get that hamburger. And you can actually stop yourself at any point. You can stop yourself if you got into McDonald's before you order. You can actually stop yourself if they actually have given it to you and you decide, well, I can't eat this. You're right. You can stop yourself before you go grab the keys and go off without a blessing. Taking the car off, because in the monastery you need a blessing to take the car. Or you can stop yourself when you hear that provocation, say, oh, that sounds good, except it's Friday during Lenten, so I'm not going to think about that. And ignore it. Now, if you look at our stream of consciousness, Have you ever sat and kind of observed your stream of consciousness? It's really quite interesting. You know, if you just sit and observe your thoughts. It's like going into bed and there's 100 TV screens. And there's, you know, there's something different on each one. You know, add the sound to all of them and you're going insane. Of course, that's what schizophrenia is. But what we do is that we've learned how to, as adults, we've learned how to hone in, like on one particular screen, on one particular line of thought, and can just ignore and dismiss all the others. So we've got all these ideas and images and words and feelings and sensations and stuff continually going through our consciousness, and we can focus on on one thing. We've learned how to focus on one thing and just ignore the rest. Now, when I was talking about schizophrenia I think is when people cannot ignore all of the other stuff that's going on. Part of it anyway. So the real core of fasting, and not just from food, but from anything, because all the passions work the same. Gluttony, that whole McDonald's thing is a description of gluttony. Lust, you know, we all understand that one. Anger, resentment, even despondency and depression work exactly the same way. Vainglory, envy, jealousy, pride, we're all wired the same, and all the thoughts, all the passions work exactly the same way. Because what a passion is, in technical language, is a habitual response to a certain kind of stimulus. Where it's so habitual that there's a kind of short circuit. It goes from stimulus to action, rather than all of those intervening steps which have become completely unconscious. And so the task, part of the task, is to be able to pull apart our actions and to look and see where, you know, how that process is happening within us, and to learn how to cut it off closer and closer and closer and closer to the source. The fathers tell us that after a certain point in the process, there's sin involved. But up to a certain point, there's no sin. It's just thought. There's even a technical word in Greek used in the patristic writings for thought, which is logismos, or logismi, thoughts. And very often what they refer to are afflictive thoughts. In other words, thoughts that really bug you. You know, like a song that you can't get out of your mind that goes on and on and on and on and on. Like a broken record. Y'all remember what a broken record is like? Old-fashioned record player. Just repeat. It hits the scratch and jumps back, and hits the scratch and jumps back. So part of our fasting, and what the fasting from food does, is it helps us to become more conscious of the processes that are happening in our minds, and that are leading us to engage in passionate behavior, which usually ends up in sin. Does this make sense? Is it clear?
Mm-hmm.
It's this is kind of basic ascetic theology, and it works the same. You know, try it. You know, just try it. Try it out on yourself. Think about. Be conscious when you, for example, look at the ads on TV or on the radio, or driving down the road, on a billboard or posted on a bus or on all of those are there to evoke passions. Okay, another example. Say you're a smoker and you're trying to stop. You're trying to stop and you're trying to stop. And you've made it for a few days and you just walked by this, down the street, and there's all this cigarette smoke on the street, and you inhale a little bit more than, whereas people who are non-smokers would probably cough. And so that, there's so you've had that kind of reminder, and then you see this ad on a bus stop or on a bus or something like that, for the cigarettes, and you got it in your mind. You start thinking, oh, how nice it would be to have something to play with, and to keep your fingers busy. Oh, how nice it would be to, just take a puff. Maybe I won't light it. Maybe I'll just put it in my mouth and smell the tobacco, and on and on and on. And we play with it, and then it comes to the point where you've played with it long enough where you're thinking, oh, it would be really nice to take a really deep lungful of that smoke and feel the nicotine and the rush and all of that. And so pretty soon, what do? You're finding yourself going to the store and buying a pack of cigarettes. Hopefully a pack and not a case. And then you light up and give in. And so you've fallen into that temptation. So what's the process? You can stop it anywhere. You can say, no, I'm not going to think about this. Or you can contradict it, and you can say, that's really disgusting. That smells horrible. Do I want to smell like that? Or that'll give me cancer. That'll give me mouth cancer. That'll give me lung cancer. Did you see what was on the internet the other day? The comparison between a lung of a cigarette smoker and the lung of a pot smoker, and how the pot is even worse than the cigarette, and so I'll take the cigarette instead. And so we go through all of this stuff in our minds, and the whole point is, if you're really sincere about trying to stop, when the thought comes into your mind, you say, no, I'm not going to go there. Start thinking about something else. There's a whole book by Evagrius Ponticus, who was one of the great early fathers. Well, some of his writings were condemned were heretical, but he ended up being one of the great fathers of monasticism and of this whole school of monastic spirituality called Evagrian. That's at the root of all Greek Orthodox monastic spirituality, all Syriac Orthodox spirituality, all of Sufism, and I would submit certain kinds of Buddhism. His influence was that profound, because it's all the same. It's all virtually identical, even in obscure details. But so Evagrius wrote a book of scriptural quotations that you can use to contradict thoughts. Say you're having you're assaulted with carnal thoughts, and so maybe he'll say, to use the verses from Psalm 50, create in me a clean heart, of God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Or you're asserted, I mean, there's all these, it's actually about a couple hundred pages long of these one or two line scriptural quotations that you can use to contradict these any kind of thought that's going through your mind. It's quite interesting. He lived in the 4th century.
Do they sell that?
Oh yeah, I think it's Cistercian Press. That's one method of dealing with the thoughts and battling with them. Now, one of the things that tends to happen is sometimes we make a little too much, we give the devil a little too much credit for our thoughts. We don't take enough responsibility ourselves for our own thoughts. And when we jump to saying the devil made me do it, well, we're shirking responsibility, because the devil can't make you do anything. The demons can't make you do anything. They can suggest, but you decide and you do, and so you are responsible. Now, the demonic is something very real, and not something to be played with. It's not useful to look at all of these demonic movies and things like that about exorcisms and stuff. It's all not accurate anyway. But know for certain that that behind provocations, according to all of the Holy Fathers, there are demons which make sure that certain provocative thoughts are planted in our minds. What we do with them is our problem. Where they come from, there's all sorts of different sources. We talked about the radio or ads on, visual images or advertising, whatever. But every image that we've ever seen, all the movies, all the hideous violence that we're exposed to, all the pornography that we've ever been exposed to, of any kind, it's all in there. It's all in our minds. And so we really don't need a lot of help from the devil. We can lead ourselves into temptation very well. So we have to be we have to be aware of that. Be aware of that. Now, so is this fairly clear so far? You see the connection between the fasting and the custody of the mind. In other words, watching our thoughts and cutting off tempting thoughts, and the whole process that leads to sinful actions from a thought. Right? That's clear. Okay. What time is it?
It's 9 o'clock.
Okay. We'll go another 15 minutes. Yeah.
What about marriage abstinence? Is that pretty strict in the church? Or?
There's a debate on that. Abstinence from sex with your lawful husband or wife is, in some schools of thought and of spiritual fathers, there are certain rules, like during Lenten periods, on Lenten days, while preparing for communion, things like that. There's one school of spiritual fatherhood that attributes that if you're a pious Orthodox Christian going to liturgy every Sunday, whether it's a fasting period or a feasting period, Tuesday night is the only time you can have sex. That's not the church's teaching. That's one particular spiritual father, one kind of school of thought. Just like also preparation for communion. In other words, so far as abstinence from sexual relations, talk to your spiritual father. You know, let him guide you in that. Preparing for communion is another set of disciplines that are relative to particular traditions and particular schools of thought within the church. So there's both in Greek and in Russian piety, up until the mid-20th century, people would go to communion very seldom. They'd go once a year or twice a year, sometime during Lent and on their name's day. And that was it. But before that, they absolutely had to go to confession, and they would probably fast for a full week, very strictly, before going to communion, and then they'd ignore all of this for the rest of the year. Wednesdays, Fridays, fasting periods. So during Great Lent, they'd take 1 week, be real strict, go to communion that Sunday, or probably that Saturday, and not go to communion on Pascha, which is like inconceivable to me anyway. And so the length of that fasting period might be 3 days, it might be 7 days, you know, depending on the particular tradition. The Greeks, the Russians, the Romanians, the Ukrainians all have different usages. Now, what's happened is that there has been a revival of consciousness in the church about the centrality of the Eucharist in the life of the Christian. And I was extremely pleased, and that actually began at the end of the 17th century. But it took until the beginning of the 21st century, at least in the Russian church, for a document to be issued declaring that the normal practice for a Christian is to go to communion every Sunday, or every time there's a Eucharist. And so there's been a lot of mixture of pieties and forms of preparation. So for example, the standard form of preparation for communion has been 3 canons and a cathist, and the prayers, the canon, and the prayers before communion. Which is pretty substantial. Pretty substantial. Now, that 3 canons and the cathist is the daily rule for monastics in the Russian tradition. So everybody would adopt to be a monk for a day when they were preparing for communion. It can be a really great exercise, and I can guarantee you, or at least from my own experience, it can really bring you to a much more heightened spiritual awareness, so that you perceive differently when you approach Holy Communion, which is part of the point. Now, our practice now, that kind of degenerated so that it just turned into linking confession and communion. That you had to go to confession immediately before you went to communion, and the quicker the better. So if you could get to church before the cherubic hymn, and get into the confession line right before you went to communion, that's always the better, because it didn't allow any time to think. Right? Well, it's not very helpful. So that kind of degenerated so that you go to confession during the vigil the night before, and then communion in the morning. But you had to go every week. Then there were certain movements in the Greek church and the OCA and other places And the Greek church has its own specific history, which is interesting, where they said, no, it's wrong to link confession and communion. You only go to confession when it's absolutely necessary, and you only go to confession if there's something really big, if you murdered somebody. So go to confession less frequently and just come to communion. Well, so that produces people not going to vigil, that produces people who just stroll in during the liturgy sometime and walk up to the chalice. And the Greek church, it's really bad in some parishes because you'll have people who don't show up until the cherubic hymn or until the Our Father, and they go to communion. And of course that drives the Russians nuts. When I was a new priest, I was in Merced, California, and there was this 75-year-old Greek lady. She'd been the wife of an Air Force officer and a widow, and she'd grown up in one of the Greek communities in New Hampshire. And she'd been to the liturgy every Sunday since she was born, and probably going to communion every Sunday since she was baptized. And she told me, because I started talking about confession and preparation, and she said, I have never been to confession, and I'm 75 years old, and I'm not going to start now. She's 50 years older than, or 40 years older than I am. You know, what am I supposed to do? You know, so I just, and besides, what's she going to do at, at that age? I mean, so I just let her have communion. Well, eventually she did come to confession. She got the idea that, well, maybe she should. And that was a great thing. In the Greek churches, the history is that during the Turkish occupation, there was absolutely no education of the clergy. And they would simply pick up a guy a pious man in the village who could read a little bit. He could read enough to do the liturgy. But they wouldn't let him preach, and they wouldn't let him hear confessions. And the only people who could hear confessions during that time were priest monks from the monastery who had a special blessing from the bishop, and they would go around from village to village hearing confessions. Well, they would only usually get to one village a week, and so the people would go to confession and they would go to communion that week, and then they'd wait till he showed up the next time to be able to go to communion again. Well, in the Greek church that broke down, and people just decided to go to communion anyway, without any preparation, and that's problematic. So, where are we now in ROCOR? It's very, very important and very valuable to prepare for communion. Confession is a critical part of our life, and we'll do a whole session or two on confession because it's that important. But preparing for communion should involve fasting. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to strict fast for 5 days or 7 days or 3 days even before you go to communion. It means that you observe the rule of the church. So you fast on Wednesday and you fast on Friday, and you go to confession and you go to communion. But it's maintaining that and building that cycle into your life of the fasting on the days prescribed, of going to the services, going to the vigil, going to the arriving at liturgy before the gospel, hopefully. Sometimes longer before the gospel, even during the hours, so that you're there you're there and you make an effort, and so that you're preparing yourself. Go to confession during the vigil the night before. Now, you don't always have to go to confession every week. If you establish a cycle with your father confessor. Figure out how often you need to go. The more the better. The more frequent the better, quite frankly, for your spiritual life. But make sure that you do everything with a blessing. So if you're going to go to confession once every 2 or 3 weeks or once a month, make sure that you do that with a blessing, and with the blessing to go to communion those other times, and unless if something really big happens, then you go to confession again. Some really big sin. Now, one of the things that drives me nuts is people who come in and they confess all of these ritual transgressions of these rules of fasting and of reading their prayer rule, and they neglect judgment and gossip and slander and sins, because when it comes down to it, not fulfilling the rule is not a sin. Yes, it's missing the mark, but it's not like a sin that's going to excommunicate you. What are the sins that are going to excommunicate you? What are the things that bring you into a state of separation from God, or that create a blockage between you and God? Because the more mature you get spiritually, at first it's, there's this list of sins, and I've either done this or not done this, and so you read the list, and it's a long laundry list, and of course we can all have a laundry list, and it's all identical every week for 20 years. In reality, the things that we want to confess and the things that we don't want to confess, right? And we're too embarrassed to confess or whatever, and which the priest knows that you do anyway. So it's like, well, it's just But the point is, you're not really confessing if all you're doing is reading your laundry list. What are the real sins that have separated you from God? Have you gotten so carried away with your thinking about a McDonald's hamburger that you jumped in the car and went 45 miles at 70 miles an hour down the mountain to go get a hamburger, even if you stopped halfway and said, "Why am I doing this?" Because you were so preoccupied, and God was nowhere to be found in your consciousness, right? Or if you told off your boss, or you told off a coworker, or you got mad and flipped somebody off on the freeway, or these, and you were so angry that it took 2 martinis and to cool down after you got home, or something like that. All of these things are where we have lost our awareness, our conscious awareness of God. And so, or that we've simply become forgetful. Now, forgetfulness in the Fathers does not mean I can't remember where my keys are. Forgetfulness means that I've forgotten God. I lost the awareness of God. Yeah.
Is that something to confess?
Yep.
So I feel like if we fail in the fasting and stuff, a lot of times it's because we succumb to the flesh and we lose consciousness of God, so wouldn't that automatically be something you should confess?
Well, yeah. But for example, if you eat a cookie with whey in it, that's not something to confess. Now, if you went out on a Friday during Lent and you specifically had milk and cookies in order to break the fast, the issue is not the milk and cookies. The issue is what's going on in your mind. In other words, 99% of our sins are actually about thoughts. When we actually let ourselves get carried away and do these things, and that's when we really need to, sometimes when we really need to go to confession. But the real sin began not when you drank the glass of milk on Friday. The real sin began, well, I'm tired of all of these stupid rules, and and I feel like having a glass of milk, and I don't care what the church says, and I'm going to do it. And it's that attitude that it's that kind of attitude that really is what creates the problem, is it creates the sin.
Vladika, what about the attitude that you say to yourself, well, I'm going to slowly embrace the fast and strip away kind of things instead of just like breaking into it, What about that? Is that mindset also?
Well, it depends if you're using it as an excuse or if that's what your spiritual father told you to do.
Okay.
Because the ultimate rule is you do what your spiritual father tells you to do. And if he tells you you're going to pass out if you like, okay, I was the abbot of a monastery, right? 22-year-olds do not fast very well. 22-year-old boys or 25-year-old boys, they have a metabolism like a blast furnace, and so right, and so 1 o'clock in the afternoon comes around and they're lightheaded, and by the time it's 3 o'clock they're ready to fall over, some of them. So it's better for them to have a little bit to eat, rather than push themselves to where they can't function. And if the spiritual father tells them to do that, that's fine. These rules are not absolute. They're tools. And that's the whole point. They're tools for us to use in the process of our sanctification and in the process of our spiritual life to draw closer to God. We make them ends in themselves. If we do that, that's idolatry. And it's in vain. So there's no point in doing that. So do what you do in consultation with your spiritual father. If you're a new convert and you've never fasted before, it's a big jump to go vegan for 6 weeks if you're used to a diet that's all meat and meat and dairy. And if you're pregnant or if you're nursing or something like that, forget it. Don't even try, because you might think, oh, I can do this, I should do this, but you're not important. That life that's within you is important. That's what's important. And so what that you break the rule? It doesn't matter. You nurture that life that's within you, and do what's necessary for that. So does this make sense? Yeah. But if all else fails, ask your spiritual father. If you can do the full rule, the full abstinence and fasting, that's good. That's very good. But don't get proud and vainglorious over it, and never, ever, ever look and see what anybody else is doing. And that's cardinal rule number 1. Never, ever think, well, that person's not fasting and I am. Well, off to McDonald's. With you, because you've just completely thrown away the whole point. You've abrogated your whole fast. So, yeah.
What's the best way yet to fast if you're surrounded by people that are not Orthodox, don't yet fast or support it? And they would want to go out on a Friday night, and normally you're a person who would be willing to join them and eat certain types of foods, and all of a sudden you're a vegan, you can't drink wine and things like that. So
do the best you can. Do the best you can. Don't drink wine, drink beer. Don't drink wine, drink Coke. Which is probably not very good for you anyway. But, you know, most restaurants have vegetarian options. You know, there's a kind of a hierarchy. If you can abstain from meat but not from eggs, okay, have an egg. If you need the protein, your doctor tells you you need the protein, have an egg. You know, you got to judge what you can do in any given situation, and especially if you're not in control of your own diet. You know, if you're eating in a cafeteria and they serve only certain things, well, as part of your ascetic task is to eat what's put before you, especially in a cafeteria, which is probably lousy. And it's an ascetic act to eat that stuff. But do your best, and that's the main thing. Like in college campuses, for example, like there's always a salad bar or something like that. And just do that, but don't draw attention to it. You know, if they order nachos, eat the chips and don't eat the meat.
What if people, you know, specifically ask you, you know, how come you're no longer eating certain foods if they kind of draw their attention?
Well, you just tell them this is my spiritual practice.
I found that people are real impressed when I tell them this is part of my orthodoxy, that I'm not going to be eating a cheeseburger, I'm going to eat fried mushrooms. And they want to know more, and that's an opening to talk about my faith.
Yeah.
But is it okay to say that you're fasted, or that's
Sure.
something you want to avoid?
Sure. I mean, if
That's what I do. I'm not a good example about very many things, so I take my life a big chunk of salt.
you know, if people ridicule you for that, well, fine. So what? You know, and that's all part of it. But you know, just do your best, and do your best not to draw any attention to what you're doing. You know, let your fasting be in secret, let your prayer be in secret. You know, this is what the Lord commands us to do. In fact, it's really important. You take a look at that passage in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6 or 7, 5, 6, and 7. And look at what the Lord. Now, if you're a guest at somebody's house, what does the Lord say? You eat what's put before you. There's nothing unclean. One of the things that's really important, and there are some monasteries, for example, because monasteries tend to cut out meat entirely. Not all, some do. But even some of the ones that do insist that the monks eat meat, for example, during Pascha, just to make sure that they don't regard it as something unclean. Because if you regard it as unclean, then you're a heretic. Actually, you're a Gnostic. Because the Lord blessed all things for our consumption. We don't fast from things because they're unclean. We fast from what's good in order to partake of what's better. That's the real rule. Yeah.
Question. I think you mentioned earlier that monastic spirituality was pretty much the same for Buddhist monks and Greek Orthodox monks.
Some of the theology.
Okay, could you please elaborate on that?
There's certain the whole description of the soul that we're familiar with, and actually the workings of the passions, like what I described to you. This whole I used the image of McDonald's hamburgers, but that was basically from Evagrius. Evagrius started that whole, and you find that in Orthodox, in Syriac, in Sufism, and in Buddhism, almost like identical. So there are passages, there are parts of some of these religions, Sufism in particular, is basically Syriac Christian spirituality without the name of Jesus, because that's who they were, you know. Sufism came out of monks wandering in the desert that found themselves in Islamic societies and didn't want to lose their heads, and they couldn't pay the tax. So, but for example, Sufis are regarded as heretics by Muslims, for most Muslims. And there was, and if you have to remember too that the Syriac Church, the Church of the East, by the 8th century was all the way to the Pacific. So all of Afghanistan, northern India, Pakistan, Tibet, much of China had huge Christian populations. And so there was tremendous interchange with Buddhism and with, of course, later with Islam, and so certain aspects were preserved, whereas they weren't able to preserve Christianity per se, but certain aspects of the spirituality were adopted. It's a fascinating history. So,
how does it make sense that somebody as spiritual and advanced and capable as Vigorous creates all these wonderful things and paths and guides, and then he becomes, you know, condemned and is a heretic?
well, Vigorous adopted a lot of, and from his teachers. He was a disciple of St. Gregory the Theologian, and I think he was ordained a deacon by St. John Chrysostom. So, I mean, with teachers like that. But if you remember, the first Philokalia was put together by St. Basil the Great and St. Gregory the Theologian, and it was a compilation of sayings of Origen. Now, Origen had some rather problematic passages, to say the least. Some of that crept over into the writing, into Evagrius, because it was such a huge... Origen's role in the East was equivalent to Augustine's role in the West. And vast amounts of Origen's theology survived in the East, even though Origen himself was condemned, after having been regarded as a saint for 300 years. But
yeah, I guess that's the thing that I'm having trouble with.
Well, yeah, it's very problematic, because he died as a confessor, and it wasn't literally for 300 years that he was until he was condemned, because some monks got a hold of his writings and created a whole heresy within the church.
Now, was Origen canonized as a saint, or was he just informally considered to be?
They didn't have canonization back that early. He died in 250. 253, actually, I believe. So that process is much later. But Saint Gregory of Nyssa too. There's Origen's elements in him. He had huge influence on Basil, Gregory the Theologian, and Saint Gregory of Nyssa. John Chrysostom was from the Antiochian school, so they didn't like that kind of philosophical approach. A lot of Origen's and Evagrius's writings survived under pseudonyms. So it's interesting history. So, any other questions?
Is there any particular fast that's more important than the other?
Yeah, those. Great Lent. Great Lent, probably then Dormition Lent, if you want to rank them hierarchically. Then probably Advent, Christmas Lent. And then the St. Peter and Paul fast, which we're in the middle of right now, is, I think it's the hardest fast, especially for us. You know, people were too busy working in the fields to go hunting, I think. You know, when we still lived in, people still lived in agricultural societies.
A lot of popularity tonight.
Yeah. Dozens. So, but, you know, just on a weekly basis, the Wednesday and Friday. Monasteries, they add Mondays to that. So then the two major feasts of the cross and of John, the beheading of John the Baptist are fast days. Now, one of the things I did get into is that there's a Lenten order of services too, and so in other words, there's liturgical support for the fasting. At least it reminds us of the fasting, and it used to be that the pre-sanctified liturgy was not just done during Great Lent, but would be done throughout the year on fasting days. So, anything else? Okay, well, let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption that gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and to ages of ages.
Amen.
Thank you.